video number 2, reviewing autism, a new introduction to psychological theory and current debate. So I was talking about social motivation, but there's queries over this because the active but odd subgroup do tend to have a lot of social motivation, and certainly not all autistics lack social motivation. So it can't explain necessarily autism for everyone. And the question also, they also ask, well, what about camouflaging and trying to fit in? I mean, after all, if you're trying to actively fit in, that would suggest some degree of social motivation, because you obviously care enough to want to try and blend in. That does suggest some degree of social desire, because if you didn't have any social motivation, why would you try to kind of fit in and conform? You wouldn't. Maybe that's what separates autistics out maybe from those who don't mask at all, and those who do is maybe get a degree of social motivation as well. Or you could consider a developmental timeline. So if there's reduced reward in response to social content in infancy, could this have an impact on the developmental trajectory in relation to quantity and quality of interaction? But this does not require that the older autistic child will still be unmotivated. So maybe the lack of social motivation, even if it's only a very subtle lack, it might not be that your child is obviously socially unmotivated. It might just be a very small kind of like anomaly where the child experiences reduced reward in response to social content, say relative to non-social input, so spending relatively more time on the non-social, even if it's not that obvious. But this could still have an impact on the developmental trajectory, even if a child then catches up with their social motivation later on. So that's a question there. Individual differences in the period of time during which the social reward systems were depressed could explain the aloof, passive and odd groups. But there is evidence that infants later diagnosed, autistic lack motivation is still wanting. And then the question is then, does the theory explain too much? You know, a good theory shouldn't explain too much and it shouldn't explain too little. But as a developmental cascade does not allow for uneven profile of social abilities. For example, autistics usually do show attachment to their loved ones. It's not like a uniform social lack, because autistics do usually show attachment to their loved ones. So the social issues in autism are usually quite specific. It's not like a blanket social deficit, which is often what people who don't know much about autism think. They think it's like a blanket social deficit, but it's not. It's a social deficit impacting very specific areas. And social motivation isn't always impacted. It can be in some, but not in everyone. Also, of course, many of the early signs of autism are non-social and often include motor issues and tiptoe walking. Indeed, that was one of the earlier signs for me. I mean, I still tiptoe walk actually when I don't have shoes on, so I've talked about elsewhere. But yeah, slight motor signs, and that was the case with me as well, but I was late to pick up certain motor skills. And that often and the concerns for that is often raised before any actual social concerns are raised. So how do we account for these non-social signs? Which would suggest again that autism does not just affect social skills, but maybe a whole domain general skill is affected. But autism is far more than just social, so you might need an account that taps into these domain general skills to look at how, which would include the social elements, but also the non-social elements. Now, there is something that I do find a little bit controversial on page 117, just before I conclude. At the end of each chapter, by the way, we have autistic contributors, which is a good thing, because often historically, books on autism have excluded the autistic voice. So I think it's a good thing that they've included autistic voices. But I don't always agree with them, however. And they do seem to be quite selective, and that the autistic people they have chosen do all tend to be, relatively speaking, successful and well integrated. Now, one autistic contributor on page 117 is someone called Anne Memott. She's an autistic autism advisor, a parent, and a business owner. She says, I and my autistic colleagues find that we're pretty excellent at paying attention to autistic social signalling. She said it's a difference in communication, not a deficit. I find time with other autistics socially rewarding. Easy to spot emotional state of autistic people. Now, this is very different to my own experience. I think it's great for her, that she finds this, and that's her own experience, but it's not my experience. In actual fact, I find being with autistic people just as draining and just as hard work on a social level as I do with non-autistics, but actually possibly even more so in some cases, because if you have, if you're with another autistic person, you're basically both socially impaired. You're both going to be struggling to some degree with reciprocity. So, in a sense, when you're together, the social issues can be compounded. Whereas when you're with, say, a non-autistic person, and obviously it depends on a non-autistic, but if you're with a non-autistic person who has the theory of mind that you lack, you're basically able to scaffold the social interaction by sort of taking a lead or kind of filling in the gaps where you're a little bit awkward, and it can just... I think I actually find it best when I'm with, say, very socially skilled and socially fluent non-autistics who basically are very skilled socially, almost like to the other extreme to me, because I find it so much easier being with them. So I disagree with her. I do not understand autistic social signalling any more than I understand non-autistic signalling, but do let me know what you think in a box below. Interestingly, Anne Memott as a child was non-verbal for her first 10 years. I'm not entirely sure what she means by non-verbal, where she means classically non-verbal, whether she was more like selectively mute. And I'm not aware that she had a learning disability or anything like that. So she said that she could sometimes speak words, but she had no concept of their meaning. But she does now speak at conferences. But I find that quite interesting because it shows how the trajectory in autism isn't always clear. That someone could start off, that just because someone doesn't speak, that doesn't necessarily predict their later outcome. But like I said, she doesn't mention her. She clearly must have a reasonably good IQ, which has obviously enabled her to eventually acquire the speech. And obviously, if someone's got a learning disability on top of their speech problems, that's going to mean their outcome is likely to be a lot less congenial. But it does show, that you can't necessarily pigeonhole people, because clearly now she's incredibly successful, whereas I was verbal right from the start, and yet I can't work or do anything like that. So, it just shows how speaking itself isn't a be-all and end-all. But anyway, I'm going to finish now, and I'm going to come back to carry on this review next week, so thank you for watching.